Welcome, and thank you for coming to this briefing by the Commissioner of the Commission of Inquiry on the Human Rights Situation in Eritrea. With us today, we have Commissioner Victor Dankwa to the extreme left and Ms. Sheila Keetharuth here closer to me. Then in the middle, Mike Smith, who is the chairperson of the Commission. We'll start with a short statement by Mr. Smith before going to questions by reporter. Mr. Smith, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, we've come to New York today to present our report to the General Assembly, the report that we had earlier presented to the Human Rights Council in response to their request in the resolution they passed last year. Our report, which is 450 pages, the long version, 20 pages, the short version, is based on interviews with 550 individuals that we have met in different countries in the diaspora. The Eritrean government decided not to cooperate with us, and therefore we were unable to visit Eritrea itself. Nonetheless, we followed a procedure that many of these commissions of inquiry do, which is to say we put out notices in the media advertising that we were we were interested in picking up, finding out information on the human rights situation in the country. And on the basis of that, as I said, 550 individuals came forward and agreed to speak to us about their own personal experiences. We weren't interested in academic treatises or political opinions on what was happening. This was really, we wanted to hear the description of what individuals went through there. And that it's on the basis of that that we drew the conclusions that we did in the report. You will see that in our report we've described systematic and widespread human rights abuses, particularly associated with the national service system. Any country, of course, is at liberty to have a national security system whereby young people come and do training and so on, do their national service. In the Eritrean context, this was originally for 18 months, which seems like a reasonable period. But the problem in that country is that after 2001, I think it was, this was extended, perhaps a bit earlier. This was extended and has turned into almost, well, at least for some people, many people, into an unending national service. People stay in the military, essentially are used in infrastructural projects and working on farms and building buildings and so on, paid a barely livable wage and unable to be able to support a family and so on, and that can go on for years. In this circumstance, on top of that, the other point of note perhaps is that there was a constitution which was drafted not long after independence, around 1997, which is, on the face of it, looks like a very good constitution. Certainly includes the creation of an independent parliament and establishes the rule of law, a Bill of Rights and so on. That constitution remains unimplemented, so there's never been parliamentary elections, and the rule of law does not seem to apply in the country. So on the basis of both the national service and the extent to which basic rights are denied, it is perhaps not a big surprise that so many young people choose to vote with their feet, to walk across the borders into neighbouring countries and from there to try and get to Europe and build another life. This is a tragedy for them because many of them go through harrowing experiences trying to get to Europe. Of course, as we know, some die when their boats capsize in the Mediterranean. And it's also a tragedy for the country because it means productive youth are not there to be able to help their country rebuild. We presented our report in June, as I said, to the Human Rights Council. Following that presentation, the Council, in its wisdom, decided to extend our mandate for another year. This was not what we asked. I know that many UN bodies seem to go on forever, but we didn't ask for that. The members of the Council asked us to extend with a particular mandate to look at whether the human rights abuses and the pattern of human rights abuses constituted crimes against humanity. So the Commission is meeting here for the first time since then, and we're going to embarking on a process of trying to fulfil that second mandate, and we'll be reporting back to the Council again in June next year. Perhaps with that, I'll leave it open for questions.
Yes, we'll start with a question from Michelle.
Thank you. On behalf of Michelle Nichols from Reuters, on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, thanks for the briefing. You touched upon the refugee crisis in your statement to the committee, and you also briefly mentioned how Europe is attempting to deal with that. And given that the European Union, I think, is considering giving a couple of $100 million to Eritrea for development, what conversations have you had with governments about sort of that delicate balancing act of trying to address the problem but the human rights issue as well?
Yeah, well, pretty much everywhere we went, which included, I think, about 5 European countries, we had discussions with the government, and this issue always came up. I think our response to that is, look, anything that can help to improve the situation of people in Eritrea so they don't need to cross the border, so that they can live a normal life, has got to be encouraged. At the same time, the fundamental problem is the denial of rights. So as part of any package that the European Union or anyone else may offer to try to develop programs, etc., to provide alternative ways in which employment and so on for young people in the country, there has to be a recognition that there needs to be changes in the way in which the authorities deal with their own people.
Yes, Matthew and then Scott.
Sure, thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for coming and taking questions. I wanted to ask, I guess I want to compare you guys' work to a couple of the other, I mean, they're rapporteurs, but in essence, UN inquiries. And one is, for example, the rapporteur on Iran, Mr. Shahid. He spent a lot of his time, I mean, not a lot of his time, but in every report he looks at the impact of external sanctions, in that case nuclear sanctions, but there are obviously the Somalia-Eritrea sanctions, on people in the country. And I'm wondering, what was your experience in looking at outside of what you're saying the government is doing, what are the impacts of the various sanction regimes on Eritrea, on people there? And also Mr. Darusman for DPRK, he looks at the impact on North Koreans outside of the country in terms of how they're being treated. And so I understand what you're saying is the basis of people leaving, but what does your report, or do you view your mandate as also including how the mistreatment or abuse or defrauding or in fact killing of Eritreans that are trying to migrate as people do from Mexico. There are other countries that people are migrating from as well. But so could you see both sanctions and treatment outside of the country?
Yeah, thanks very much, Matthew. I think it's a pretty good question. I mean, we're quite limited in terms of not having access to the country to measure those sorts of things. Now, I know that Sheila, in her capacity as Special Rapporteur, has looked at issues of economic, social and cultural rights, and so perhaps she has had more of an opportunity to look at that sort of thing than us. Frankly, in our interviews with people, and I really like to emphasise that what we've reported on and what we've drawn our conclusions from is the stories which people tell us. Frankly, the economic side of it has not been a significant factor. What people have talked about, they haven't said, oh, we couldn't get this, we couldn't get that because of sanctions. What they're saying is that we get put into training at the age of 17 and our dreams are destroyed because we have no future. That's the story that we're getting, and that's why they say they're leaving the country. But Sheila, do you want to say something?
Just very briefly to say that the sanctions in Eritrea are very specific. There's an arms embargo. There is a 2% tax issue. In my research, what I have found that these do not impact directly on the people who are leaving. Probably the one thing which I would like to bring to your attention is the fact that most of the people I have spoken with do say that if there were no remittances directly to their families, it would be very difficult for them to live. So the 2% tax goes to the government, but that doesn't stop others, family members, to send remittances which help a lot in terms of how people are able to access to have sufficient means or to be able to supplement their means. So this was the area I've looked at. I haven't really seen the direct impact of sanctions on the fact that people were leaving. However, people are still able to benefit from remittances, which goes directly to their families.
Just one follow-up. Do you think in part this could be one of the limitations of obviously you're constrained to speak to people that have left? I mean, is there any attempt on your maybe the government won't speak to you, but to find out from the people that are in the country what the impact of the sanctions are? If you see what I mean. It seems like a slightly different question than what people that left, their view of the sanctions.
Yeah, I'll quickly just say, I haven't spoken to people inside the country because I understand very much the restrictions, and that would, the government has very much shown that it, the limitations in terms of who I can speak with. So that's not a question that's one of the questions I would have liked to ask, but I haven't asked any questions at all. So it falls in that basket of not having the possibility of talking to people inside the country without how shall I say, without the blessing in quotes of the government. I haven't breached that.
Question from Scott, yes.
Yeah, Scott Anderson from the Canadian Broadcasting
Could you use the microphone, please? It will get on, I think, if you start talking. On the microphone. On the microphone itself.
There we go. Sorry, Scott Anderson from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Can you talk first of all about some of the stories you heard about the labor involved in the construction of the Bishop mine?
Yeah, well, we frankly, this was not a. It only popped up in a couple of interviews, but what we heard from those individuals was that prior to the establishment of that mine, there were, if you like, infrastructural aspects, roads and so on that were built, and that several of these people said that they did that as part of their national service. In other words, the company, they were assigned to a labour supply company by the Eritrean government, even though they were actually working in the military, being paid, their 500 nakfa, which is, a few dollars a month, and they, it was under military discipline. That's the only instance which I think we've come across. We are quite, again, because of our modus operandi, we didn't sort of follow every rabbit down every rabbit hole, simply because we had to take the stories as they came to us, and then after that, on the basis of the information we had, draw the conclusions we could. And there was one conclusion was that yes, there was an incident there. That's as much as I can say.
Did you, sorry, just to follow up then, the mining company Nevsun, the Vancouver mining company, told us that they've tried to supply you with information. Did you at any time consult them, and are you aware of the human rights impact assessment that they've done in Eritrea?
Yes, well, we were aware that they contacted us quite late in the piece, but since they were talking about the situation, as I understand it, after they went into the country, we had no information on that beyond the general constraints that everyone faces. So basically their labour practices, if you like, were not relevant to the situation we were describing. So we didn't see much value in talking to them. We do understand that they've done a human rights assessment, impact assessment, and I think we've seen that. Well, I've read it.
Yes.
But I guess the point is, the company concerned is working in Eritrea under a system which is pretty absolutely controlled by the government. So I feel that their impact assessment probably reflects that situation.
Just finally, can you say, did you find evidence categorically of forced labor in the construction of the Bishop mine?
We found individuals who said that that happened in their building of the infrastructure for the mine, yes.
Well, we have to leave it at that if there's no other questions. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, commissioners, for coming.